The irony wasn't lost on me. There I was, staring at legal documents on my 65th birthday, delivered not by my lawyer, but by my own daughter Rebecca, flanked by my sons Michael and David. "It's time for your freedom, Mom," she explained, her voice carrying that familiar tone of someone who thinks they know what's best for you. But what Rebecca didn't know, what none of my children knew, was that I'd been preparing for this moment for 6 months. And the evidence locked away in my safe was about to turn this birthday surprise into the most empowering chapter of my entire life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other birthday in recent years. Quiet. Peaceful. I'd made myself coffee in the kitchen of the sprawling Victorian home where I'd raised 3 children and buried 1 husband. The same kitchen where I'd hosted countless birthday parties, holiday dinners, and family gatherings that seemed to grow smaller each year as my children became busier with their own lives. At 72, I'd grown accustomed to celebrating my special days with simple pleasures, a good book, my garden, and perhaps a phone call from one of the grandchildren. But today felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension I couldn't quite place. When the doorbell rang at precisely 10 in the morning, I wasn't entirely surprised to see all 3 of my adult children standing on my front porch, dressed in their best business attire. What did surprise me was the manila envelope in Rebecca's manicured hands and the uncomfortable expressions on their faces. "Happy birthday, Mom," Rebecca said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. At 42, she was the eldest and had always appointed herself the spokesperson for the family. Behind her, Michael shifted uncomfortably in his expensive suit, while David avoided my gaze entirely, focusing instead on his phone screen. I invited them in, of course. These were my children, the people I'd sacrificed everything for. Worked multiple jobs to put through college, supported through divorces and career changes. The living room felt strangely formal as they arranged themselves on the furniture I'd carefully chosen over decades of marriage to their father. "We need to talk, Mom," Rebecca began, sitting forward on the edge of the sofa. "We've been discussing your situation as a family, and we think it's time for some changes." My situation. The phrase hung in the air like a judgment. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one positioned to catch the morning light streaming through the bay windows, and waited for whatever revelation was coming. Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, you're 72 years old. You shouldn't be maintaining this big house alone anymore. The stairs, the garden, all the upkeep, it's too much for someone your age." "We worry about you," David added, finally looking up from his phone. "What if you fall? What if something happens and no one finds you for hours?" Their concern felt rehearsed, like lines they'd practiced before this performance. I studied their faces, seeing traces of the children I'd raised but struggling to recognize the adults they'd become. When had they started looking at me as a burden instead of their mother? Rebecca reached for the envelope. "We've found you a beautiful assisted living community. Sunshine Manor has excellent reviews and they have activities, on-site medical care, and you wouldn't have to worry about cooking or cleaning anymore." "It's really quite nice," Michael added quickly. "Private apartment, social activities, and it's only 20 minutes from Rebecca's house." I took the envelope, noting how my hands remained steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. The documents were professionally prepared. Admission papers for Sunshine Manor, power of attorney transfers, and at the bottom, authorization to sell the family home. "You want me to sign my life away," I said quietly. "We want you to be safe." "And happy," Rebecca corrected. "Mom, you're living in the past. This house is just a building with too many memories. You need to embrace your freedom, make new friends, live without the burden of all this responsibility." Freedom. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. Freedom from the home where I'd built my life. Freedom from my independence. Freedom from making my own choices. This wasn't freedom they were offering. It was surrender. "The house needs significant repairs," David said, pulling out his phone to show me photos. "The roof, the foundation, the electrical system. It's going to cost a fortune to maintain, money that could be used for your care instead." I looked at the photos on his screen, recognizing the staged nature of the damage. Water stains that had been there for years suddenly looked catastrophic. Minor cracks in the foundation appeared magnified. The electrical panel that had passed inspection just 6 months ago was now being presented as a fire hazard. "We've already spoken to a real estate agent," Michael continued. "The market is hot right now. We could get a good price, enough to cover Sunshine Manor for several years, and leave something for your grandchildren's college funds." My grandchildren. The trump card they knew I couldn't argue with. Emma, who was starting high school, and dreamed of studying marine biology. James, who wanted to be an engineer like his grandfather. Little Sophia, who still called me every week to tell me about her art projects. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Have you discussed this with them?" I asked. "With Emma and James and Sophia? Have you asked them how they feel about Grandma being shipped off to an old folks' home?" The uncomfortable silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. This decision had been made in boardroom-style family meetings where I wasn't invited to participate in discussions about my own future. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd perfected in her career as a marketing executive. "Mom, you're being emotional about this. We've done the research, run the numbers, considered all the options. This is the best solution for everyone." Everyone except me, I thought, but didn't say. Instead, I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd tended for 43 years. The roses were blooming magnificently, their pink and white petals catching the morning sunlight. The vegetable patch showed the first green shoots of this year's tomatoes and peppers. This wasn't just a house. It was the repository of my life's work, my memories, my identity. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "Mom," Rebecca's voice carried a note of impatience. "We've booked you a tour of Sunshine Manor for next week. The sooner you embrace this change, the easier the transition will be." Embrace this change. Easier transition. They were speaking to me like I was a difficult client who needed to be managed rather than their mother who deserved respect and autonomy. After they left, promising to check on me in a few days, I sat in my living room surrounded by the documents they'd brought. The silence felt different now, not peaceful, but heavy with the weight of what I'd just learned about my children's perception of me. Somewhere along the way, I'd transformed from the strong, capable woman who'd raised them into a liability they needed to manage. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their careful planning. They'd underestimated me completely. I walked to my home office, the small room where I'd balanced checkbooks, planned family budgets, and later, after their father's death, learned to manage investments and property taxes. The children saw this room as evidence of my growing confusion and inability to handle complex matters. What they didn't know was that I'd been using this space for something else entirely over the past 6 months. I opened the safe hidden behind my father's oil painting and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were documents that would change everything. Financial records, property assessments, legal correspondence, and most importantly, recorded conversations. I'd suspected this day would come ever since David had started asking pointed questions about my finances 3 months ago. Ever since Michael had brought up future planning during our last family dinner. Ever since Rebecca had begun dropping hints about downsizing and simplifying my life. I'd hired a private investigator, not because I was paranoid, but because I was pragmatic. When someone starts questioning your mental capacity while simultaneously showing unusual interest in your assets, it's time to get answers. What I'd discovered would have broken my heart if I hadn't already begun the process of protecting myself. The assisted living facility wasn't just convenient. Michael was part of the investment group that owned it. The real estate agent wasn't. Randomly chosen. She was Rebecca's college roommate who specialized in quick sales below market value. The urgent repairs David had photographed weren't urgent at all. They were minor issues deliberately presented as major problems to justify immediate action. My children weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to liquidate me. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Emma's number, my 16-year-old granddaughter calling as she did every few weeks. "Hi, Grandma. Happy birthday. I'm sorry I couldn't call earlier. I had a chemistry test this morning." "Thank you, sweetheart. How did the test go?" "Really well, I think. Grandma, I was wondering, could I come stay with you this summer? Mom and Dad are talking about some kind of family trip to Europe, but I'd rather work in your garden and maybe get a job at the Marine Center downtown." My heart clenched. Emma had no idea that by summer, if her parents had their way, there would be no garden to work in and no grandmother's house to stay at. "Of course, darling. We'll make this the best summer yet." After I hung up, I sat for a long time thinking about Emma's voice, full of excitement and possibility. She saw the summer ahead as an adventure, a chance to grow and learn. Her parents saw me as a problem to be solved. But they'd forgotten something important about the woman who'd raised them. I didn't just survive challenges, I conquered them. When their father lost his job during the recession, I'd gone back to school and started my own bookkeeping business to keep our family afloat. When the neighborhood tried to force us out with harassment and discrimination, I'd organized the community and fought back through the courts. When cancer tried to take their father, I'd researched every treatment option and fought beside him until the very end. I wasn't the helpless old woman they thought I'd become. I was the same woman who'd taught them that you don't back down when something matters. You don't let others make your decisions for you, and you certainly don't surrender without a fight. The evening light was fading as I spread the contents of my folder across the dining room table. Financial documents showing my perfect credit score and substantial savings. Property assessments proving the house was worth significantly more than their agent had quoted. Medical records from my recent physical showing perfect cognitive function and excellent health for my age. And most damning of all, transcripts of recorded conversations where my children discussed their mother problem and how to convince her to make the right decision. They wanted my freedom. They were about to learn what freedom really looked like when it came with the power to choose my own destiny. Tomorrow, I would begin implementing the plan I'd hoped I'd never need to use. But tonight, I poured myself a glass of the good wine, the bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion. My 65th birthday had indeed turned out to be special, just not in the way anyone had expected. I raised my glass in a toast to the woman in the mirror, the one my children had forgotten was capable of fighting back. They'd delivered papers thinking they were giving me freedom. Instead, they'd given me the motivation to show them exactly what a truly free woman could accomplish. The game was just beginning, and they had no idea they were playing against a master. The morning after my children's birthday surprise, I woke before dawn with the clarity that comes from having a purpose. While they slept peacefully in their suburban homes, confident they'd handled the mother situation with professional efficiency, I was already 3 steps ahead of their carefully orchestrated plan. My first stop was downtown to meet with Patricia Henley, the attorney I'd quietly retained 2 months ago when David's probing questions about my estate planning had become too frequent to ignore. Patricia was nothing like the soft-spoken family lawyer who'd handled my husband's will. She was sharp, direct, and specialized in elder law with a particular focus on protecting seniors from financial exploitation, even when that exploitation came from their own families. "Margaret," she greeted me warmly, gesturing to the chair across from her mahogany desk. "I take it yesterday's meeting went exactly as we predicted?" I handed her copies of the documents Rebecca had brought, watching as Patricia's expression hardened with each page she reviewed. "It's all here," she said, shaking her head. "The classic pattern. Create urgency about your living situation, present a pre-selected solution that benefits them financially, and pressure you to make immediate decisions while you're emotionally vulnerable." "What they don't understand," I replied, settling back in my chair, "is that I learned to recognize manipulation tactics 50 years ago when I was raising them. The difference is, back then I used those skills to get them to eat their vegetables and do their homework." Patricia laughed, but her expression remained serious. "The recordings you provided are particularly valuable. Having them on tape discussing how to manage you and divide the proceeds from your home sale gives us significant leverage." "But Margaret, I need to ask, are you prepared for how ugly this might get when they realize you're not the compliant elderly mother they think you are?" I thought about Emma's excitement about spending the summer in my garden, about the book club I hosted every month for women in the neighborhood, about the volunteer work I did at the literacy center where I taught adults to read. My children saw these activities as quaint hobbies that proved I had too much time on my hands. They didn't understand that these connections were the foundation of a rich, purposeful life I'd built after their father's death. "Patricia," I said firmly, "I've spent the last 7 years grieving my husband and rediscovering who I am as an individual. I've traveled to places we never had time to visit, learned new skills, made new friends. I've finally reached a point where I love my life exactly as it is. I'm not about to let anyone, even my own children, steal that from me." My next stop was the Riverside Community Bank, where I'd done business for over 30 years. James Morrison, the branch manager, had known me since he was a junior teller fresh out of college. Now in his 50s, he treated me with the respect that came from watching me successfully manage my finances through decades of marriage, widowhood, and economic ups and downs. "Mrs. Chen," he said, standing to greet me in his office. "What can I do for you today?" "I need to restructure some of my accounts, James, and I need to do it in a way that protects my assets from potential family interference." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't ask questions. Banking confidentiality had taught him when to listen without judgment. "What did you have in mind?" Over the next hour, we established a new trust structure that would protect my primary assets while maintaining my complete control over day-to-day finances. James also helped me set up automatic payments for all my household expenses, property taxes, and insurance premiums, creating a paper trail that would demonstrate my continued competency in financial management. "Your children don't realize it yet," James observed as we finished the paperwork, "but trying to declare someone financially incompetent when they have perfect credit, substantial savings, and impeccable money management skills is an uphill battle. They're counting on the stereotype," I replied. "They think being 72 automatically means being vulnerable and confused. They've forgotten that I managed our family finances for 40 years, while their father focused on his engineering career." From the bank, I drove to Hammond Investigations, the discreet office building where I'd first met Detective Sarah Reynolds 3 months ago. Sarah was a former police officer who'd specialized in financial crimes before starting her own private investigation firm. She'd helped me gather the evidence that now filled my safe at home. "Margaret!" Sarah greeted me with genuine warmth. "Perfect timing. I just finished compiling the final report on your children's financial activities." She handed me a thick folder, and I settled into the comfortable chair in her office to review the contents. What I found was even more damaging than I'd expected. Michael's involvement in Sunshine Manor went deeper than simple investment. He was part of a group that specifically targeted elderly individuals whose families wanted to liquidate their assets quickly. The facility offered kickbacks to family members who convinced reluctant seniors to sign admission agreements, with additional bonuses if the resident's property could be sold through their preferred real estate partners. Rebecca's relationship with the real estate agent was more complex than friendship. They'd worked together on multiple elderly transitions, splitting commissions on below-market sales that benefited buyers who were also part of their network. The pattern was clear. Identify isolated seniors, convince their families that immediate action was necessary, facilitate quick sales at reduced prices, and profit at every step of the process. David's role was perhaps the most calculating. As a certified public accountant, he'd been positioning himself to take over my financial management by slowly documenting what he presented as evidence of my declining capacity. Every time I'd asked him to explain a complex tax document, he'd recorded it as confusion about financial matters. Every question about investment performance became evidence of memory problems. "They've been building a case against you for months," Sarah explained. "David has files documenting every interaction, every question you've asked, every moment of normal human uncertainty about complex financial matters. He's been systematically creating a narrative that you're no longer capable of managing your own affairs." The betrayal cut deep, but it also crystallized my resolve. These weren't children concerned about their mother's welfare. These were adults who'd identified their inheritance as a business opportunity that required my cooperation or removal. "There's more," Sarah continued, pulling out another section of the report. "I traced their communications with each other. They've been planning this for over a year, ever since your house was appraised higher than expected following the neighborhood redevelopment project." She showed me email exchanges where my children discussed my stubbornness about maintaining my independence, my unrealistic attachment to the family home, and their frustration with having to wait for their inheritance. The language was clinical, businesslike, devoid of any recognition that they were discussing their mother as if she were an obstacle to their financial goals. The most painful revelation came in a text message thread between Rebecca and her husband. "Mom's being impossible about the house situation," Rebecca had written. "We need to present a united front and make her understand this isn't really her choice anymore. At her age, family has to make the hard decisions." Her husband's response was equally cold. "Just remember, we're not the bad guys here. We're protecting her from herself and securing the kids' college funds at the same time. Win-win." I closed the folder and sat quietly for a moment, processing the full scope of what my children had planned. They'd created an elaborate scheme to strip me of my autonomy, sell my home for less than its value, and warehouse me in a facility that would profit from my presence while they divided the proceeds from my life's work. What they didn't count on, I said finally, was that I might investigate them as thoroughly as they investigated me. Sarah smiled. "That's exactly what makes this so satisfying. They saw a vulnerable elderly woman who could be manipulated. They never considered that you might be a strategic thinker who could outmaneuver them." My afternoon was spent at the Riverside Public Library, where I'd volunteered for the past 3 years teaching literacy classes to adult learners. The head librarian, Dr. Amanda Foster, was a woman in her 40s who'd become not just a colleague, but a trusted friend. When I'd first approached her about volunteering, she'd been skeptical about whether a senior citizen could relate to the challenges faced by adult literacy students. 3 years later, I was one of their most requested tutors. "Margaret, you look like a woman with something important on her mind," Amanda observed as I settled into her office with 2 cups of coffee. "I need to ask you a favor, Amanda, a significant one." I explained my situation carefully, watching her expression change from curiosity to anger as I detailed my children's plans. Amanda had seen firsthand how capable and sharp I was during our work together. She knew my organizational skills, my patience with difficult students, and my ability to adapt teaching methods to different learning styles. "Those ungrateful." She stopped herself, remembering we were in a public institution. "Margaret, what do you need from me?" "I need character witnesses, people who can testify to my mental acuity, my reliability, my continued capacity to make sound decisions and contribute meaningfully to my community. Amanda didn't hesitate. You have it. Not just from me, but from every staff member here, every student you've taught, every volunteer you've worked with. Margaret, you're one of the most competent people I know at any age. She opened her computer and began typing. I'm drafting a letter right now documenting your volunteer work, your teaching effectiveness, your leadership in organizing community events. If your children think they can paint you as an incompetent elderly woman, they're about to learn how wrong they are. As Amanda worked, I reflected on the community I'd built over the past 7 years. After my husband's death, I could have retreated into isolation and grief. Instead, I'd forced myself to engage with the world in new ways. I'd joined hiking groups, taken cooking classes, learned to use social media to stay connected with distant friends and relatives. I'd traveled to Ireland with a senior tour group, tried skydiving for my 70th birthday, and last year I'd started taking photography classes at the community college. My children saw these activities as evidence that I was trying too hard to stay young, refusing to accept the limitations of age. They couldn't understand that I was actually embracing the freedom that comes with maturity, the freedom to try new things without worrying about other people's expectations, the freedom to speak my mind without diplomatic considerations, the freedom to live authentically without apology. The final stop of my day was the most emotionally challenging. I drove to Willowbrook Cemetery where my husband Robert was buried. Standing beside his headstone, I found myself talking to him as I often did when facing difficult decisions. They want to put me away, Robert, I said softly, kneeling to place fresh flowers on his grave. Our children think I'm a burden who needs to be managed rather than a person who deserves respect. The wind rustled through the oak trees, and I could almost hear his voice responding. Robert had always been proud of my strength, my ability to handle whatever challenges life presented. He'd supported my decision to go back to school when the children were teenagers, encouraged my small business ventures, and cheered when I learned to manage our investments after his retirement. I know what you'd tell me, I continued. You'd say that I taught them to stand up for themselves, and now it's time to show them what that really looks like. I spent an hour there, remembering the life Robert and I had built together in the house my children now wanted to sell. We'd chosen that neighborhood for its excellent schools, staying even when we could have afforded something more expensive because we valued stability for our family. We'd hosted birthday parties in that backyard, helped with homework at that kitchen table, nursed sick children in those bedrooms. The house wasn't just a building with maintenance issues. It was the repository of our family's history. Every room held memories of Christmas mornings, graduation celebrations, first dates, and family dinners. When my children looked at it now, they saw square footage and market value. When I looked at it, I saw the foundation of everything meaningful in our lives. Driving home as the sun set, I felt a sense of calm determination settling over me. My children had spent months planning their intervention, convinced they were doing what was best for everyone involved. They'd underestimated not just my capacity to fight back, but my willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect my autonomy and dignity. Tomorrow would bring the next phase of my response. I had lawyers, investigators, financial advisors, and community supporters all ready to help me demonstrate exactly how capable and sharp I remained. My children wanted to treat me like a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected. They were about to learn the difference between a vulnerable elderly woman and a strategic fighter who'd simply been underestimated. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson would be one they'd never forget. The third morning after my children's ultimatum, I implemented what I privately called Operation Dignity. While they expected me to spend the weekend anxiously reviewing the Sunshine Manor brochures and preparing for my inevitable transition, I was orchestrating a response that would fundamentally shift the power dynamic in our relationship forever. My first move was calling an emergency family meeting for Sunday afternoon. Not the kind they'd grown accustomed to, where they presented their decisions and I listened quietly, but a formal gathering where I would control the agenda, the setting, and most importantly, the narrative. "Rebecca," I said when she answered her phone, my voice carrying the authoritative tone I'd perfected during my years managing the household and later my bookkeeping business. "I need you, Michael and David, here Sunday at 2 o'clock. We need to discuss your proposal properly." "Oh, Mom, that's wonderful," she replied, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "I knew you'd come around. Should we bring the admissions paperwork for Sunshine Manor?" "Bring whatever you think is necessary," I replied calmly. "I'll be prepared as well." What I didn't tell her was that I'd spent Friday afternoon at Kinko's, having multiple copies made of every document in my investigation folder. I'd organized everything into presentation folders, one for each of my children, with tabs marking different sections: financial records, property assessments, legal documentation, and most damaging of all, transcripts of their recorded conversations. Saturday was devoted to transforming my dining room into what Patricia had jokingly called my war room. I cleared my grandmother's antique table and replaced the usual centerpiece with a neat stack of documents, a recording device, and a laptop computer. The formal dining chairs were arranged to face my position at the head of the table, a subtle but unmistakable power arrangement. I also made strategic phone calls to my support network. Dr. Amanda Foster agreed to be available by phone if character references were needed. James Morrison from the bank prepared a written statement of my financial competency. Most importantly, Patricia would be present for the meeting, not as a family gathering participant, but as my legal counsel. The transformation in my appearance was equally deliberate. Instead of the comfortable casual clothes my children associated with elderly mother, I chose the navy blue suit I'd worn to business meetings during my bookkeeping career. I arranged my silver hair in the professional style I'd maintained throughout my working years, applied makeup with the same precision I'd used for client presentations, and wore the pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary, symbols of elegance and accomplishment. When my children arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, their confident expressions faltered the moment they saw the formal setup. Rebecca carried her manila envelope of documents, Michael had his laptop for the financial presentation they'd prepared, and David brought a briefcase full of what I assumed were his carefully documented examples of my supposed incompetency. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the chairs I'd arranged. "I believe you know Patricia Henley, my attorney." The introduction of Patricia as my attorney, rather than simply a family friend, sent the first clear signal that this meeting would be different from what they'd expected. Patricia, dressed in her most intimidating court attire, nodded professionally at each of them while placing her own folder of documents on the table. "Mom," Rebecca began, clearly trying to regain control of the situation, "we appreciate you taking time to consider our proposal. We've brought additional information about Sunshine Manor and the timeline for—" "Rebecca," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "You'll have time to present your materials. But first, I have some information to share with all of you." I opened my laptop and activated the recording software, noting how all 3 of my children shifted uncomfortably when they realized the meeting was being documented. "6 months ago," I began, "I hired a private investigator to look into some irregularities I'd noticed in my financial accounts and property assessments. What she discovered was quite illuminating." I handed each of them their personalized folder, watching their faces as they opened them and saw the scope of what I'd uncovered. The color drained from Michael's face as he saw the documentation of his involvement with Sunshine Manor's financial kickback scheme. Rebecca's hands trembled, slightly as she read the transcripts of her conversations about manipulating me into a quick property sale. David's professional composure cracked entirely when he saw his own words documented, his systematic attempts to build a case for my mental incompetency. "I want you to understand something very clearly," I continued, standing and moving to the window where the afternoon light highlighted the garden they wanted me to abandon. "What you've presented to me isn't concern for my welfare. It's a sophisticated financial scheme designed to liquidate my assets for your benefit while warehousing me in a facility where you can profit from my placement." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Michael found his voice. "Mom, you don't understand the complexity of—" "Don't." The single word cut through his explanation like a blade. "Don't insult my intelligence further by pretending. This is about complexity I can't grasp. I managed our family's finances for 40 years. I built and ran a successful business. I've navigated widowhood, property management, and investment decisions with complete competency. The only thing I don't understand is how the children I raised to value honesty and integrity became adults who would manipulate their own mother for financial gain." Patricia opened her folder and began presenting the legal implications of their actions. "What your mother discovered constitutes attempted elder abuse under state law. The conspiracy to misrepresent property values, the plan to place her in a facility where family members receive financial benefits, and the systematic documentation designed to question her mental capacity all fall under statutes designed to protect seniors from exactly this type of exploitation." David, ever the accountant, tried to shift into damage control mode. "There's been a misunderstanding. We were genuinely concerned about Mom's ability to maintain the house, the expenses, the physical demands." I returned to my seat and opened another section of my documentation. "Let's examine these concerns systematically, David. You photographed water damage in the basement and presented it as catastrophic structural failure. Here's the actual assessment from the structural engineer I hired last month. The damage is cosmetic and requires approximately $800 to repair." I turned to another page. "You documented electrical issues as fire hazards requiring immediate attention. Here's the report from the licensed electrician who inspected the entire system last week. Everything is up to code, with only minor updates recommended for convenience, not safety." Michael tried to interrupt, but I continued relentlessly. "Rebecca, your real estate friend provided an assessment 20% below current market value for comparable properties in this neighborhood. Here are 3 independent appraisals showing the actual value. The difference represents approximately $60,000 that would have disappeared into your network's profit margins." Each revelation hit them like a physical blow. They'd spent months constructing their narrative of a declining elderly woman who needed their protection, and I was systematically destroying every pillar of their argument with facts, documentation, and professional assessments. "But perhaps most importantly," I said, reaching for the final section of my presentation, "let's address the question of my mental competency that you've all been so carefully documenting." I handed them copies of my recent medical examination, including cognitive assessments that placed me in the 95th percentile for my age group, bank statements showing not only perfect financial management, but growth in my investment portfolio over the past 3 years. Letters of recommendation from the library where I volunteered, the community college where I took classes, and the hiking club where I served as treasurer. Dr. Amanda Foster has agreed to testify about my organizational skills and teaching ability, I continued. James Morrison will speak to my financial acuity and long-term planning capabilities. Margaret Williams from the hiking club can discuss my physical fitness and leadership roles. I have character witnesses who can demonstrate that far from declining, I've actually expanded my capabilities and community involvement since your father's death. Patricia took over the presentation, her legal training evident in her systematic approach. What we have here is a clear pattern of attempted financial exploitation disguised as family concern. Your mother isn't a vulnerable elderly woman who needs protection. She's a competent adult who discovered your scheme and took appropriate action to protect herself. The transformation in my children's demeanor was remarkable. They'd arrived confident and prepared to manage what they saw as an emotional elderly woman's resistance to necessary changes. They now found themselves confronted with legal consequences, documented evidence of their deception, and the realization that their mother was far more formidable than they'd imagined. Rebecca, always the family spokesperson, tried one last approach. Mom, even if there were misunderstandings about the specifics, the basic concern remains valid. This house is too big for you. Wouldn't you be happier in a community with people your own age? I smiled, recognizing the patronizing tone she'd perfected in her marketing career. The voice she used with clients who needed to be convinced they wanted what she was selling. Rebecca, I replied, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I am happier now than I've been in years. I wake up every morning in the home where I raised my family and built my life. I tend a garden that gives me joy and purpose. I teach adults to read, which fills me with a sense of contribution and meaning. I travel, learn new skills, maintain friendships, and live exactly the life I choose to live. I stood again, this time moving to stand behind my chair, using the physical position to emphasize my authority. You want to take all of that away from me and replace it with scheduled activities, institutional meals, and the company of people whose only shared characteristic is their age. You call that freedom, but what you're actually offering is surrender. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The same clock that had marked time through decades of family dinners, homework sessions, and bedtime stories. The irony wasn't lost on me that this clock, which my children now saw as outdated furniture in a house too large for its owner, had witnessed both the happiest moments of our family life and now this moment of reckoning. Patricia opened her briefcase and withdrew a final set of documents. Your mother has prepared a response to your proposal, she announced. These are legal documents establishing clear boundaries for future interactions and protecting her assets from any further attempts at manipulation. The papers included a formal rejection of any assisted living placement, a restraining order preventing any family member from making medical or financial decisions on my behalf without clear evidence of incapacity, and most importantly, a new will that reflected my current assessment of my children's character and priorities. The will is particularly interesting, Patricia continued with professional detachment. Your mother has restructured her estate to ensure that her assets will support causes and people who respect her autonomy and dignity. The house will be donated to the Literacy Foundation where she volunteers, with a trust established to maintain it as a community resource. Her financial assets will fund scholarships for adult learners returning to education. The implications hit them immediately. Not only had their scheme failed, but their actions had cost them the inheritance they'd been trying to secure through manipulation. They'd gambled their relationship with their mother against financial gain and lost both. David, ever focused on numbers, was the first to grasp the full scope of what had happened. Mom, you can't be serious. We made mistakes, but we're still your children. Surely we can work something out. I sat back down, folding my hands carefully on the table. David, you are my children, and I will always love you. But love doesn't require me to enable your attempt to control my life or reward your willingness to exploit me for financial gain. Michael tried emotional manipulation, his voice cracking slightly. Dad would be devastated to see the family torn apart like this. Your father, I replied firmly, would be devastated to learn that his children tried to manipulate their mother into giving up her independence and dignity. He spent 43 years supporting my strength and capability. He would expect me to defend myself against anyone who tried to diminish that, even his own children. Rebecca made one final attempt to salvage the situation. What do you want from us, Mom? What would it take to repair this? I considered her question carefully. These were still my children, despite their betrayal. They were still the babies I'd held, the toddlers I'd taught to walk, the teenagers I'd guided through their mistakes. But they were also adults who'd made calculated decisions to deceive and exploit me. I want you to understand that I am not your problem to solve, I said finally. I am not a burden to be managed or an asset to be liquidated. I am a competent adult who deserves your respect, not your pity or your schemes. If you can genuinely accept that I have the right to live my life on my own terms, then we can rebuild our relationship on that foundation. I paused, looking at each of them in turn. But if you cannot accept my autonomy, if you continue to see me as someone who needs to be protected from herself, then our relationship will remain exactly as it is now, formal, distant, and legally protected. The meeting ended with my children, leaving in stunned silence, their folders of evidence tucked under their arms like report cards they were ashamed to show their parents. Patricia and I sat in the quiet dining room, surrounded by the documentation of a battle won, but at a cost that would forever change the fabric of our family. As the afternoon light faded, I realized that this confrontation had been about more than just protecting my house or my independence. It had been about defending the fundamental principle that age doesn't automatically equal incompetence, that loving someone doesn't give you the right to control them, and that dignity is not negotiable regardless of the source of the threat. My children had tried to write the final chapter of my life story. Instead, they'd given me the motivation to write it myself. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, I stood in my kitchen preparing breakfast and watching the morning news when the local reporter mentioned a story that made me smile with quiet satisfaction. Sunshine Manor, the assisted living facility at the center of a recent elder abuse investigation, has agreed to pay substantial settlements to affected families and implement new oversight procedures to prevent future exploitation of vulnerable seniors. The investigation that had begun with my private detective's work had expanded far beyond my personal situation. Sarah Reynolds had connected with other families who'd experienced similar pressure tactics, and together we'd built a case that exposed the entire network of facilities, real estate agents, and family members who'd been profiting from forced elderly relocations. Michael's investment group had been dissolved, Rebecca's real estate partner had lost her license, and David faced professional sanctions from the state accounting board. But this morning's news wasn't why I was smiling. Today marked the official opening of the Margaret Chen Community Learning Center, the literacy foundation that would inherit my house and continue serving adult learners for generations to come. The transformation had taken months of planning, legal work, and renovation. But seeing my life's greatest investment, my home, become a lasting resource for people pursuing education and personal growth filled me with a sense of purpose I'd never experienced. The doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock, and I opened it to find Emma standing on my porch with a suitcase and a radiant smile. At 17 now, she'd grown into a confident young woman whose values aligned far more closely with mine than with her parents. The summer program we'd designed together would allow her to intern at the Learning Center while taking marine biology courses at the community college. "Grandma," she said, wrapping me in a hug that reminded me why this fight had been worth everything. "I can't believe Mom and Dad almost succeeded in making you give all this up. This place is going to help so many people." Emma had been the unexpected catalyst for healing in our fractured family. When she'd learned about her parents' scheme, she'd confronted them with the kind of moral clarity that only teenagers possess. Her disappointment in their actions had forced them to examine their behavior in ways my legal documentation couldn't achieve. Children, I'd discovered, have a way of holding their parents accountable that cuts deeper than any court proceeding. "Come see what we've accomplished," I said, leading her through the house that had been transformed while maintaining its essential character. The living room now served as a comfortable study space with built-in bookshelves and modern technology for online learning. The dining room had become a conference area where tutors could work with small groups. My old home office was now the center's administrative headquarters, equipped with computers and filing systems for tracking student progress. The most meaningful transformation was in the basement, where we'd created a multimedia learning lab. The space that David had photographed as structurally unsound now housed computers, recording equipment for language learning, and interactive displays that made education accessible to people with different learning styles. Every time I walked down those stairs, I remembered his attempts to convince me the foundation was failing. Instead, we'd built the strongest foundation possible, one dedicated to lifting others up. The best part, I told Emma as we toured, the renovated space, is that this will outlast all of us. Long after I'm gone, people will be learning to read in these rooms, improving their English, earning their GEDs, and changing their lives through education. Dr. Amanda Foster arrived, shortly after Emma, carrying the folders and schedules that would guide our summer programming. Over the past 6 months, Amanda had become not just a colleague but one of my closest friends. Our partnership in creating the Learning Center had shown me the power of intergenerational collaboration. Her educational expertise combined with my life experience and resources to create something neither of us could have achieved alone. "Margaret," Amanda said, settling into what had once been my breakfast nook and was now our planning center. "I have incredible news. The waiting list for our summer adult literacy program is over 200 people. We're going to need to expand our volunteer tutor program much faster than we anticipated." The success of the Learning Center had surprised everyone, including me. We'd expected modest interest from the local community, but word had spread through social media, community organizations, and news coverage of the elder abuse case. People were driving from neighboring counties to participate in our programs, drawn not just by the free education, but by the center's underlying philosophy that it's never too late to transform your life. "I have an idea about that," I said, pulling out a proposal I'd been developing. "What if we create a senior volunteer program specifically for people like me, retirees who have professional skills and want to contribute meaningfully to their communities?" Amanda's eyes lit up as she reviewed my outline. A mentorship program pairing retired professionals with adult learners pursuing career changes. "Margaret, this is brilliant. You're creating a model that could be replicated across the country." The concept had evolved from my own experience of feeling dismissed and undervalued by my children. There were thousands of seniors who faced similar assumptions about their declining relevance, who were encouraged to step back from meaningful engagement with the world. Instead of accepting that narrative, we could create opportunities for older adults to share their expertise while continuing to learn and grow themselves. Emma looked up from the student registration forms she'd been reviewing. "Grandma, there's a 78-year-old woman here who wants to learn to use computers so she can start an online business selling her handmade quilts, and a 65-year-old man who wants to earn his GED because he never graduated high school, but always regretted it." These stories had become the heartbeat of our work. Every student who walked through our doors carried dreams that had been deferred but not abandoned. They reminded me daily that age is not a limitation on growth, ambition, or the pursuit of new possibilities. They also reminded me that my children's view of aging as inevitable decline was not just wrong, it was harmful to everyone who accepted that limiting perspective. The morning flew by as we finalized preparations for the center's grand opening. Celebration. Local officials would be present, news crews would document the event, and most importantly, our current students would share their stories of transformation and growth. I'd invited my children, though I wasn't sure they would attend. Our relationship had evolved into something more honest, but less comfortable than before. They treated me with newfound respect, but the easy familiarity of our earlier interactions had been permanently altered. At noon, Patricia arrived for our weekly check-in meeting. What had begun as legal consultation had developed into a friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to elder rights advocacy. Patricia had been inspired by my case to expand her practice's focus on preventing elder abuse, and she'd become a frequent speaker at conferences about protecting senior autonomy. "The ripple effects keep expanding," Patricia told me as we sat in my garden, now part of the Learning Center's outdoor classroom space. "I received a call yesterday from an attorney in Oregon who wants to replicate your legal strategy for a client facing similar family pressure. Your willingness to fight back publicly has given other seniors permission to resist manipulation. This unexpected role as an advocate and model for elder empowerment had given my life a dimension I'd never anticipated. Speaking engagements. At senior centers, interviews with journalists covering aging issues, and consultations with families facing similar conflicts had expanded my world far beyond the boundaries my children had tried to impose. At 72, I was busier, more engaged, and more fulfilled than I'd been in decades. The irony, I told Patricia, is that my children's attempt to force me into retirement actually launched the most active and meaningful phase of my entire life. Emma returned from her lunch break with exciting news. The community college wants to partner with us on a program for seniors interested in technology careers. They're seeing increasing numbers of older adults who want to learn coding, digital marketing, and online business skills. The boundaries between student and teacher had become wonderfully blurred at our center. I was learning as much as I was sharing, discovering new perspectives from people whose life experiences differed dramatically from mine. A retired factory worker was teaching me about practical problem-solving approaches while I helped him with reading comprehension. A young mother was showing me social media marketing techniques while I guided her through basic accounting principles for her startup business. As the afternoon approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 8 months ago, I'd been a widow living quietly in a house my children saw as too large for my needs. Today, that same house buzzed with activity as students, tutors, and volunteers prepared for an evening celebration of learning and possibility. The transformation hadn't been without costs. My relationship with my children would never return to its previous innocence. They'd lost their inheritance, faced legal consequences for their actions, and been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their motivations and values. But they'd also been freed from the burden of believing they needed to manage my life, and I'd been liberated from the expectation that I should gracefully accept their control. Rebecca had surprised me most during this process. After the initial shock and anger of our confrontation, she'd begun attending therapy to examine her relationship with control and manipulation. She'd called last week to apologize, not just for the assisted living scheme, but for years of subtle efforts to shape my choices according to her vision of appropriate behavior for someone my age. I realize now, she'd said during our phone conversation, that I was treating you the same way I treat difficult clients, identifying their resistance points and developing strategies to overcome their objections. I forgot you weren't a business problem to be solved, but my mother who deserved respect. Michael had taken a different approach, throwing himself into learning about elder rights and advocacy. His professional skills in financial planning were now being used to help other seniors protect their assets from exploitation. He'd established a pro bono practice specifically for older adults who suspected family members of financial manipulation. David's response had been the most dramatic. He'd taken early retirement from his accounting firm and enrolled in a master's program in gerontology, focusing on healthy aging and senior empowerment. His experience with our family crisis had opened his eyes to the pervasive ageism in professional environments and inspired him to dedicate his remaining career to countering those biases. Even their children had been affected by the family upheaval. Emma's younger cousins now called me regularly, eager to hear about the learning center and my various projects. They'd begun to see their grandmother not as a diminished version of a once capable woman, but as someone actively creating positive change in the world. The modeling effect had been powerful. They were learning that aging doesn't mean accepting limitations, but rather discovering new ways to contribute and grow. As evening approached and guests began arriving for our celebration, I took a moment to stand in the garden that had become a symbol of my resistance to others' expectations. The roses were blooming more magnificently than ever. The vegetable garden was producing abundant harvests that our cooking classes used for nutrition education, and new plantings had created spaces for outdoor learning and contemplation. Emma appeared beside me, now dressed in the professional attire she'd chosen for her role as student coordinator. "Grandma, are you ready for this? There are already over 100 people here, and the news crews want to interview you about the center and your advocacy work." I smiled, thinking about how different this evening was from the quiet birthday dinner I might have expected at my age. Instead of celebrating another year of gradual withdrawal from meaningful engagement, I was marking the launch of an initiative that would impact thousands of lives for decades to come. "Emma," I said, taking her arm as we walked toward the house filled with celebration and possibility. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The transformation from potential victim to community leader, from dismissed elderly woman to respected advocate, from isolated widow to the heart of a thriving educational community, had taught me the most valuable lesson of my 72 years. The story of your life is never finished as long as you're willing to keep writing it. My children had tried to write my final chapter for me, convinced that my best years were behind me, and my remaining time should be spent in quiet comfort and diminishing engagement. Instead, their attempt to control my narrative had inspired me to begin the most meaningful chapter yet, one dedicated to proving that wisdom, experience, and determination only grow stronger with age when they're combined with the courage to resist others' limitations. Tonight, surrounded by students, volunteers, community leaders, and family members who finally understood that supporting someone means empowering them rather than protecting them, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from transforming betrayal into purpose, resistance into creation, and personal struggle into community benefit. The Learning Center would continue long after I was gone, but its existence would always remind people that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to learn something new, and never too late to discover that your greatest contributions might still be ahead of you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.